Okay, colleagues, I would ask you to take your seats. We don't have much time left and need to start right away. I'm glad to announce our next panel. It's called Culture, Perception, and Soft Power. My name is Maxim KHARKEVICH. I teach here as an associate professor and edit our journal. It's called MGIMO Review of International Relations and Russian International Studies. We have a very distinguished panel today. Let me introduce all of them. Mark KALININ, he is the head of the Department for Cooperation, Education and Science from the Russian Federal Agency for Cis Affairs, Compatriots Living Abroad and International Humanitarian Cooperation. Short version is Rossotrudnichestvo. Then to my left is Vladimir Pechatnov. He is a professor and head of Department of European and American Studies at MGIMO, a well-known expert in the field of U.S. history, the Cold War, and Russian-American relations. He graduated with honors from MGIMO University in 1970 and received his PhD and doctorate degrees from the Institute of U.S. and Canadian Studies of Russian Academy of Sciences. Elizabeth Prodromal is a visiting associate professor of conflict resolution from Fletcher School. Before coming to Fletcher, she served as a diplomatic appointment as vice chair and commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and she was a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion Foreign Policy Working Group. Her research interests focus on the intersection of religion, democracy, and security, with particular expertise on religion and geopolitics in the Near East and Southeast Europe. And Andranik Mavsesovich Migranyan, he's our professor from MGIMO University. He graduated from MGIMO in 1972. He holds PhD degrees from the Institute of International Labor Movement in 1978 and has been a visiting fellow at Harriman Institute, Columbia University, San Diego State University, and he is an author of numerous books and publications, one of the leading authors of the theory of democracy. And from 2008 to 2015, he was the director of the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation at New York. So I would like to welcome all our participants at the panel, and let me start from giving the floor to Mark Andreevich Kalinin. So please.
Здравствуйте.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'd like to start my remarks with two important quotes, one in English and the other one is in Russian. Aldous Huxley, in his O New Brave World, wrote,
"And of course, stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability."
So stability is not as spectacular as instability. And 100 years before that, Mr. Tutchev wrote a wonderful verse. The one who entered the world at the minutes which were of the important decision-making, the distinguished person who was allowed to enter. Thus, these two quotes, as I think, describe clearly the situation in which our modern world is existing. At the mid-20th century, the focus in the relations of the great powers was on the military and political as well as economic issues. Our planet in less than 50 years saw two devastating world wars, and as a result, we saw the establishment of the new security and safety system. In 1945. The US and the USSR put great focus on politics and humanitarian law. Example, during the second session in Los Alamos on 6th of May 1945, the Committee on the Targeting recommended as the object to apply nuclear weapons Kyoto, Hiroshima, and 3 more Japanese cities. And the military minister of the US, Henry Stimson, crossed out Kyoto out of the targets list because he thought that this is a city of a great cultural importance for Japan, and because he knew and he liked Kyoto because when he was young he spent his honeymoon in Kyoto in Japan. An interesting result of this decision-making was the following. The US started to develop actively the programs of the interstate youth exchange programs. In 1946, the State Department started the Fulbright programs of education to strengthen cultural and educational connections between the citizens of the US and other countries. And the USSR started to attract hundreds of thousands of students from other countries of the world and gave them education for free in the USSR. So at the mid-19th century we had 2 camps. The military camp that was, as a habit, thought that as far as we have missiles and submarines with nuclear equipment, the humanitarian cooperation has no meaning. But at the same time, we had the second camp of the scholars and humanists who called for the international youth exchange for one simple reason. A person who in his youth lived or studied or worked in another country is unlikely to become a person who would decide to bomb with nuclear weapons a state where he has friends. And this is the rationale behind this. Now to the 21st century, Russia started to pay a lot of attention to the humanitarian field in the international cooperation starting with 2007-2008. In 2007, marking the 200th anniversary of American-Russian relations, we've convened the International Conference on Education and Science, and we published a detailed overview and analysis in retrospective and hindsight of the relations between our countries over the last 200 years and the cooperation in the humanitarian field, education and science. In 2008, the concept of the foreign policy of Russia had the following task: to achieve for the objective perception of Russia in the world by developing its often efficient means of informational influence of the public opinion abroad. And Russia started new funds, the Public Diplomacy Foundation of Gorchakov, Rossotrudnichestvo that I represent, television channel Russia Today, and a number of other state institutes. The concept of the foreign policy of Russia of 2013 and 2016 had for the first time the term soft power. Soft power is a term that covers a complex of issues and has a lot of interpretations in the scientific field, starting with the ability of the country to influence other countries through any means except military means, including manipulative influence, propaganda, and ending with the long-term cooperation, increasing the attractiveness of a country and export of cultural and ideological values. And as we see, it is quite a broad definition. And the instruments, the kit that the state can use to increase its soft power is quite big. It includes public, popular, educational diplomacy, scientific diplomacy, and NGOs and institutional decisions that mean the establishment of official institutes or actors in other countries. Here I'd like to mention the role of Rossotrudnichestvo in this system. Our mandate is described in the decree of the President of 2008, and our steps are aimed at the implementation of policy of international and humanitarian cooperation abroad, and to inform about the role of Russia abroad. So this is the humanitarian task of Rossotrudnichestvo. We are not a development agency, we are not engaged in propaganda, we are not manipulating public opinion, we are just carrying out our work, being politically correct within the international law and national law of the country where we work. This is the export of Russian education, support of the Russian language, interaction with the Russian diaspora abroad, development of dialogue with the civil society, cultural cooperation, development of scientific cooperation. This is quite clear, and these are elevated tasks aimed at the development of friendship and understanding between our countries and peoples. Now, about our work in the U.S. The Russian Center for Culture and Education in Washington is very popular among Russians living in the U.S. The building of this center was acquired by the Soviet government, and for more than 30 years it hosted the school for Russian diplomats. In the 90s, the ceremony of the opening of the Russian Cultural Center took place. In the last years, we see a growing interest to our center by the number of the various government bodies of the U.S. who a couple of years ago tried to accuse us, saying that we are an agency that is implementing strange goals, but in fact we're just promoting cultural exchange, short-term trips to Russia of the youth from various countries. These accusations are ridiculous. At the very beginning of my speech, I talked about the exchange programs and why we need them. Tens of thousands of Russians went to the U.S. within work and travel programs, Camp America and so on, and we only welcome such exchange programs. In March of this year, the head of Rossotrudnichestvo representative office in the U.S. was asked to leave the U.S. and the head of the cultural mission has been put on the list of non grata people, and this is beyond any rational. And we know that it's unacceptable that the head of such a center cannot be engaged in any other activity except the one which is official.
Здравый смысл возобладает, и отношения между гражданами России и США будут иметь позитивную повестку, что мы будем разговаривать друг с другом, слушать, понимать друг друга, как в рамках вот этой площадки, например. Потому что ни в коем случае нельзя дать замолчать дипломатам, а всем присутствующим в этом зале известно почему. Большое спасибо.
Спасибо, Марк Андреевич. Все уверены, что так и будет. Следующий выступающий Владимир Олегович Печатов.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about something else. Although
Vladimir Pechatnov has the floor.
Included into our panel discussion. Observing the current scene of Russian-American relations, I'm struck by the symmetry of reactions on both sides. During the recent years, both have gone from one extreme into another. In the American case, this trajectory has been from euphoria about Russian democratic transition to demonization of Russia as a hopeless, evil empire and enemy number one. And this is not unique. This is in tune with the familiar cycle in American attitude toward Russia, described so well by my American colleague, Rutgers historian David Fogleson, in his book, American Crusade and the Evil Empire. Now, this is the third time during the last 100 years that Americans go from euphoria to gloom about Russia. First were revolutions of 1917, where Russia went all the way from being a sister republic, that's how Woodrow Wilson called it in his 14 points, to Bolshevik Gulag. Second time it was World War II, of course. Russia, from the gallant ally of the Grand Alliance, became Cold War state. And then the third period, the current one, is from Perestroika to Putin. Each time, Americans get very excited about Russia's democratic transformation, only to be frustrated in the end by lack of its progress. And each time, they blame Russians for not living up to their expectations and move from engaging Russia to containing it. During the current third U-turn, they mistook a marginal Kozyrev Gaidar group for real new Russia and wrote off all other political forces as, what was the idiom, red-brown reactionaries in decline. We ourselves contributed to this by playing a junior partner role in the late 80s, early 90s. So when Russia began to turn to its more traditional combination of strong centralized government and great power posture, Americans found it unacceptable and declared that Russia had gone in the wrong direction. On the Russian side, there has also been a U-turn from embracing the West to estrangement from it. We have our own cycle of love and hate relationship with the West, in which high hopes intermingle with frustrations. The higher the hopes, the greater are frustrations. And hopes were very high indeed. Being in Washington that time and in Russia too, I vividly remember romantic pro-Americanism of the late 80s, when Russians could see nothing wrong or bad about your country. And when they even named their newly born Ronald and Nancy Reagan. Russians naively hoped that now that they had done away with communism, the West, led by the United States, would embrace us, assist in our democratic transition, and that we would happily and safely live thereafter. Well, the transition turned out to be torturous. American help, very stingy and often counterproductive. And the West, instead of embracing us warmly as equals, began to spread its political and military presence to our borders with little regard to our security. No wonder Russians began to feel endangered, besieged, and mistreated. Displaying the same lack of self-attribution as Americans, they now blame the West for everything that went wrong. In most cases, the situation is aggravated by domestic politics. In a public sphere, there is a premium on toughness, and it's much safer and even profitable to overdo the nation in danger theme, which contributes to mutual escalation. Hawks on each side are feeding upon each other, as John F. Kennedy used to say. What makes it more difficult is also the fact that these black and white images, or stereotypes, are not pure demagoguery, but they are rooted somehow in cultural codes of both countries. What is to be done? Our question today. How to break this vicious and dangerous circle in which suspicion on one side breeds suspicion on the other, and new weapons beget counter-weapons. First of all, to de-escalate the current tension and to decontaminate the atmosphere. A lot has been said and written recently in both countries about growing and allegedly unsurmountable value gap between Russia and the United States. According to conventional wisdom, this gap in itself dooms us to mutual hostility and even confrontation. I find this cultural determinism too fatalistic and overblown. Divergent cultural codes by themselves do not fight, and they are not immune to change. Hostility among nations, as well as among individuals, is not eternal, and it will pass someday. But it wouldn't happen by itself. It would take some leadership and public education. A lot depends upon political leaders of both countries. A good example is JFK American University speech 55 years ago, which still makes a very impressive reading. Another example is Ronald Reagan's turn from bellicosity of the early 80s to reaching out to the Soviet people and leaders even before Gorbachev showed up. But also a lot depends upon experts like ourselves, who know better, who understand that there are many shades between black and white. Most importantly, experts should have empathy with the other side. Not sympathy, but an ability to put yourself into other guy's shoes, to relate to his concerns and way of thinking. Yet now experts' voices on both sides are subdued, confused, and mute. And when they're loud, for the most part, they often pour more oil into the flames rather than water. So we should raise our voices, including collective ones like at this conference, in order to bring about a better understanding of the other side and to find a common ground between our two countries. Let me finish on the rhetorical flourish. To quote my favorite speech again, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit the small habit. We all breathe the same air, and we are all mortal. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir Olegovich. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Prodromal. Please. You can speak from your seat there.
It's okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So I want to thank the organizers of the conference and for your hospitality and also for bringing us all together. I've organized my remarks to respond as closely as possible to the framing questions for our panel. So I begin with the simple claim that there's actually little need to debate the significance of soft power in both U.S. and Russian foreign policy. And I think the previous panelists have illustrated that, in fact, both countries have long historical records that evidence a recognition of culture, religion, and more generally, ideas, relationships, and identities as useful tools in pursuing national interests and foreign policy. Furthermore, both Washington and Moscow currently use soft power as part of their geopolitical repertoire in the space of formal diplomacy, in the academic and think tank spaces, and in the context of popular culture and manufacturing consent in various types of media. Indeed, both the United States and Russia fund and mobilize those institutions and entities that generate narrative and cultural narratives and construct cultural and symbolic maps as part of their soft power repertoire. What I'd like to do is to actually focus on the specific factor of religion as a soft power tool, beginning with three areas where religion is generating tension in terms of soft power and its deployment between the U.S. and Russia, and then turn to consider how the possibilities of escalation and confrontation can be repurposed in collaborative and complementary ways. First, one area where we see religion and soft power is in the mapping of Eurasia as a space where religious boundaries and differences are used to justify spheres of influence and the use of hard power in terms of threat and otherness. Here I refer to the dominance and reflexive use of civilizational discourse and imagery that turns on religion. Accordingly, the U.S.-West Transatlantic Alliance on the one hand and Russia on the other hand draws on wellsprings of Eurocentrism and Orientalism that position this rational, peaceful Western Christian Occident against the irrational, violent Eastern Christian and Asiatic Islamic Orient. Huntington's civilizational paradigm in U.S. foreign policy and the Eurasianist school in Russian foreign policy use religion as a cornerstone in the mainstreaming of this narrative of a neo-Cold War, and soft power is part of that narrative. Second, religion figures as a soft power tool in the competing discourses that are used by Washington and Moscow in arguments about human rights, and especially in the contested debates about international religious freedom. Accordingly, the U.S. sees Russia as the leader of a group of countries that reject or undermine the universality of freedom of conscience, belief, or religion, as expressed in the UDHR, the ICCPR, etc., using international fora to revise and or disrupt the global human rights regime that protects international religious freedom. Conversely, Russia sees the U.S. as politicizing and instrumentalizing religious freedom as a mechanism for American imperialism and interference in the domestic affairs of other countries. And the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's designation of Russia as a country of particular concern, the State Department International Religious Freedom reports are viewed by Russia as religious soft power efforts of the U.S. in the context of international religious freedom. And then third and finally, religion is part of the soft power repertoire that's used by Washington and Moscow in their respective foreign policies in the Middle East, specifically regarding competing approaches to remedying religious persecution and the vulnerability of Christians and other religious communities. Russian foreign policymakers, bloggers, and religious leaders see the U.S. as indifferent to the condition of Christians in Iraq, Syria, Israel, Egypt, and as a sign of U.S. hypocrisy and cynicism about religious freedom, given America's willingness to subordinate human rights commitments to economic and military interests involving allies such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt. Conversely, the U.S. sees Russia's positioning as a self-proclaimed protector of Middle East Christians as a cynical instrument for expanding Russia's geopolitical footprint under another version of spiritual security and an effort to expand the purview of the Moscow Patriarchate at the expense of the Vatican and of other Orthodox Christian churches. So, if these are the points of tension that grow out of soft power and religion as an instrument of soft power, how can we reconfigure the 3 points in terms of possible modes of cooperation? And I'll very, very briefly offer some suggestions for consideration. First, create religious dialogue and reconciliation programs that involve faith-based leaders from both countries, demonstrating the shared empirical reality of religious pluralism in both countries. This reality of religious pluralism is increasing in both cases in terms of demography and migration, and it makes religious pluralization a point of commonality. Second, support exchanges of legal and constitutional experts from both countries who can present differing approaches to religious freedom and explore the importance of conscience, belief, and religion for other foundational civil and political liberties. Third, support shared academic and think tank research that deconstructs the civilizational paradigms that are the convenient go-tos both in Washington and Moscow, and that consider how religion can be a tool of soft power integration rather than competition. Fourth, dig deeper into transnational religious alliances and see how they may be operating to support political projects. And we can say more about this in detail in discussion. Fifth, consider shared interests and understanding how religious discourses can be used to counter violent extremism and radicalization by focusing on rule of law and equality, and especially by looking at how religious blasphemy laws and defamation of religion laws work to undermine rule of law and free speech. And then finally, collaborate on joint commitments to preserving cultural and religious heritage sites in international fora. Both Washington and Moscow can commit to preserving cultural and religious heritage sites that sustain either the active presence or the historical memory of endangered and vulnerable populations, and that reinforce the dynamic of pluralism rather than exclusivism. Now, these are aspirational, but they are suggestions that actually can build on past and existing programs, many of which enjoy U.S., Russian, and international funding, and that can recognize and better understand how religion as a soft power tool figures into both perceptions and realities of a U.S.-Russia relationship that currently is in a state of dangerous escalation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was very interesting. Usually religious was a tool of sharp power, not a soft power. Our next speaker is Andranik Mosesovich Migranyan. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Many years ago, in 1990, when I was working in America during high time of perestroika and traveling all over the United States universities, once occasionally I happened to be in Fletcher School on Law and Diplomacy. When I asked, who are these people, what they are doing? And Yanis Adomanis, the guy from Ebenhausen, from Germany, he said, you know, Taft is very provincial university, but Fletcher School is very good. Since that time, I never been at Fletcher School, but heard a lot because Fletcher School is famous because a lot of Armenian revolutionaries who are now in power in Yerevan, they graduated some classes over there. I don't know whether this is a tribute for them, or this is a benefit, or this is a danger for Armenian government and statehood. But it's another problem. Might be we'll touch upon a little later of this issue. I like this three, formulated questions for this panel: perceptions. What we can say about perceptions? Terrible, terrible perceptions. American perceptions are even more terrible. I'll try to explain why. Because, as my very good friend Dmitry Symes usually used to tell me, American journalists are lazy, shallow, and in many cases very stupid. That's why they are trying to borrow all publications in Russian liberal press among some liberal politicians and multiply that in American reality without understanding what's really going on in this country. But in any case, the result is that perceptions are formulated by intellectuals and by journalists. By and large, these perceptions are formulated one-sided, distorted, incorrect. You know, I am living for a long time in this world, and I can memorize, and Volodya sitting next to me, we studied very close to each other at this institute many, many years ago. In America, there was a perception of Soviet Union, and in many senses, the perception of Soviet Union was one-sided, but the other side was absolutely correct. They like to ignore all positive sides of Soviet society, Soviet ideology, Soviet reality. But in what they were absolutely right, that Soviet Union was existential threat for the United States. Soviet ideology was oriented towards total and complete negation of liberal democracy. Soviet Union wanted to propose for the world a real final truth and final model of a world, which on what basis this world must be organized and formed. And, if you had only one, not bad guy, but very shallow thinking Professor Fukuyama about the end of history, in Soviet Union and in communist thoughts, we had thousands and thousands, because every Soviet ideologist was talking that bourgeois democracy is doomed, it's finished, they will survive, might be another 10, 20 years. And even in preface to Trilateral Commission report, Crisis of Democracy, the Problems of Governability of Western Democracies, Zbigniew Brzezinski, at 75, I think, in 1975, he quoted Willy Brandt, who said, Western democracies will survive until the end of this century. That was 75, until 2000. And after which they will be drowned in the sea of totalitarian dictatorships. which means we were predicting one thing, you were predicting another things, but in reality it's much, much different and much more sophisticated and multicolor rather than black and white. The problem is that after the collapse of Soviet Union, when Russia ceased to be an existential threat, Russia adopted all Western values and institutions, as well as Russia could swallow and digest. Russia still is considered to be a danger, to be a threat, to be a foe and enemy. It's very funny because Russia is 1/10 or 1/20th part of GDP of the United States and the West at large. Russia doesn't have even common borders with Westerners, except the borders which are moving towards Russia through enlargement of NATO eastward enlargements during last 20 years. And still Russia is considered to be a threat. And it's in case when Russian liberalism and capitalism was much wilder than American and Western. But still, this wrong and distorted picture of Russia is very, very actively circulated in American media, in American television, newspapers. I spent almost 10 years, last 10 years in New York, working and trying, as everybody was joking here in this country, that I was sent by Putin to fix American democracy because American democracy in danger. That's true, American democracy in danger. I fixed as much as I could fix, but then I had to leave because, I realized that bringing to power Trump, the rest Trump will destroy because I couldn't do that much destruction as Trump can do for Americans. Anyway, the problem is that unfortunately the perception of Russia is totally wrong, totally distorted. It's formulated by Russian intellectuals here, pro-Western, extreme liberal groups of people, and hardly you can find on American television talk shows like George Stephanopoulos' show, like, Face the Nation, Meet the Press, or Chris Wallace on Fox News, or a couple of very extremely liberal, crazy talk shows on CNN. Hardly you can see any normal Russian representative trying to formulate some adequate picture of Russia. Anyway, this is the result why we are very wrongly perceiving each other. Second problem is culture. We are, of course, belonging to the same cultural tradition, European cultural tradition. But we are on different phases of the development of European culture. We are still close to traditional European values. We value religion, family, tradition. We value many things which was, something important for Europe many, many years ago. America especially, and of course the West, but America especially, it's a post-European value system in American culture. The crisis of religion. At the beginning of last century, Werner Sombart and Max Weber used to say that you can be atheist, you can be non-believer, you can be paganist, you can be everybody, but you have to be part of, parish of your church, otherwise you are out of society. Today, nobody cares about that. And the crisis of religion in America, crisis of family, crisis of tradition and culture is so evident that one of the greatest thinkers, I consider him really as a brilliant thinker and politician in America, Patrick Buchanan, had to write with a great pain the book which was called Suicide of Superpower: Can America Survive Until 2025? Because of internal reasons, cultural crisis, interethnic crisis, interracial crisis, and many, many different kinds of crises. This is not Russian perception. This is perception of very American, brilliant intellectual politician and thinker. And, you know, I am not mentioning political correctness and same-sex marriages, which is, of course, very significant events, which is absolutely incompatible with Russian perceptions, tradition, and culture. And the last thing which I would like to mention here, it's a soft power. Joseph Nye is a good guy. He proposed this idea. This idea is circulating everywhere. But I must tell you that soft power for Russia and for today's America is in past. No soft power today's America, zero soft power, and very little soft power today's Russia. Because Soviet Union had tremendous, and United States at the beginning of 20th century, and even until the middle of 20th century, a great soft power. Soviet Union, free education, free medical care, free housing, fantastic vertical mobility. You could be in peasant family and became Secretary General. Each time we were studying here in MGIMO, reading obituaries. Yeah. Member of political bureau, minister, born in who knows, in Siberia, in a peasant family, lived and growed up, but this was the rule. This was, something which everybody could see, everybody could follow. And of course, at that time, we had the sense of equality, which is the most important achievement, because today, number one problem in the West, and unfortunately in our country as well, is the problem of inequality. Stiglitz, Joseph, who mentioned many, many times about this problem, lack of vertical mobility in the United States. And the most astonishing thing which I heard recently in one of the programs of Farid Zakaria, he several times repeated that 3 Americans, Bezos, Buffett, and what's the name of the guy? Gates. 3 of them, they have more wealth than 50% low-level Americans, which means 160 million Americans have less property than 3 only these persons. And this inequality is killing liberal democracy, killing existing political order in the West, and of course blocking every opportunity for vertical mobility. My institute in New York published several reports, and with a big pain, because I was always a big admirer of America, and I thought that this is the country of endless opportunities, and Hollywood culture, American dream. And it's sad when you are reading that, like in South America and in Africa, if you used to born in poor family, you are doomed to be poor, and you have very few opportunities, unfortunately, to climb upper and upper in social hierarchy, which means it's a pity, but on these all three areas, we don't have anything in common except might be the level of inequality. And unfortunately, I would like to finalize what I said. The organizers mentioned that might be, who knows, people-to-people diplomacy, scientific and cultural exchanges could improve the situation. We can better understand each other and might be work together and achieve together something which even we could do under communists, Apollo, Soyuz. We remember at that time we had really much wider and deeper cooperation in many areas. Unfortunately, recent sanctions against Russian diplomats, expel of our diplomats, after which we expelled several hundred people from American embassy, situation developed from bad to worse. No visas, endless and long lines for getting visa, a lot of impediments, and nobody knows how the situation is going to develop. If I'll be Russian specialist in America and had a chance to advise Trump, I could tell him, listen, Soviet Union opened, and we were the most pro-Western and pro-American country in period when during Perestroika, America opened the borders, opened itself. We had a huge exchanges through different lines, students, diplomats, politicians, public figures. Closing Russia now from the other side and building the Iron Curtain is the worst thing you can do when you are dealing with Russia, because the idea of isolation of Russia and punishment of Russia is the most stupid thing which humankind could invent in human history. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei Mafsesovich. We're happy you are back from New York. And now the floor is open for the questions. We don't have much time. At 17:30, we need to round up. Coffee break is waiting for us. So who have questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself.
Dear speakers, if you allow, I want to ask in Russian.
Is it okay or English?
It's okay, yes, you can ask in Russian. Please identify yourself.
My name is Yuri, Department for Global Political Processes. The commentary question on soft power. Question to all speakers. Do you think that the concept has been outdated? The West admits this, but in Russia we start to understand with a little delay that what is happening in terms of the fact that the concept hasn't justified itself. Some history facts. This concept, why did it appear in the 90s? The West was told what to project. It was told that, yes, there is soft power based on the values, the model of values that was considered to be universal. That is liberal democracy, market economy. So the values that the West wanted to export globally, thinking that these are universal values. And Fukuyama also wrote about it. These were ideas that were extremely popular in the 90s, but now the situation is totally different. The Western society is not homogeneous anymore regarding the assessments of the importance of liberal democracy for the West itself. Is that true that we can say now that the soft power today, when we see that the Western society is not homogeneous anymore, can we say that these values and institutes that are important for the West, does it need to expand these values to other non-Western countries? Thank you.
I would like to say sorry because I had to cut short my presentation. That's why I didn't mention important thing. Thank you for your question. The problem is that during the last elections, I heard old Soviet slogans formulated by Bernie Sanders as an unachievable goals for American society. And he became, this is the soft power of old Soviet Union. When Bernie Sanders was telling the people, and millions of youngsters, students, intellectuals were supporting him and following him, he said he would like in America to have free education, free medical care, free housing. All these old soft power goals and ideas are still alive, and they'll be alive forever. Which means what was the past of Soviet Union, it's unachievable future for United States. Sorry.
If I may add just one point. This is not the first time that we're talking about the crisis of legitimacy or crisis of ideas coming from the West. During the Great Depression, the old notions of democracy, markets, capitalism went into very deep decline all over the world. Whereas the Soviet model, the Italian corporativism, and even fascism were in fashion, right? Then we had the renaissance of liberalism, of liberal democracy, with a new socialization of the old concepts. And we had a new wave of Western influence all over the world. So I don't think we should consider the current crisis, which Andronik described so vividly, as the end point of the Western development. I'm sure that the liberal democracy would survive Trump, and would be enlarged by other experiences, perhaps by the left populist or left even socialist ideals. So it's not the end of the world in this sense.
Liberal democracy and populism is the dominant trend in the Western world now.
And with this kind of revival, we can expect another surge of soft power coming from the West.
Okay, there is another question.
But we are not,
My name is Roberto Dalimonte. I'm not American, and I would have liked to listen some of the Americans here in the audience to say something about their country in the picture that has been given of America. I'm Italian, but I have some familiarity with the U.S. The topics that have been touched are very relevant, of course. The crisis of liberal democracy. But it would take another conference, I think, to really understand what are the reasons for the crisis of liberal democracy. I limit myself in saying that it appears more serious in America because in America is the country that is going through, in my opinion, a the deepest economic change in the Western world. Because the crisis of liberal democracy is about, to summarize it, is a problem of the weakening of the middle class. And the weakening of the middle class is due to these tremendous digital revolution and the consequences of the digital revolution, which is also the source, in my opinion, of the inequality that you're referring to. And that inequality in America is an inequality that has created, it has turned peasants into billionaires, not really peasants. I'm thinking of all the young kids in America that have moved up in American society, young kids which started from a garage in Palo Alto. And it continues to be true. America is still the place, in my opinion, where a young kid with ideas has a better chance to implement his ideas and become a millionaire in the process than anywhere else in the world. That said, I know that America is in trouble. And you're right to point out American difficulties, the difficulties of liberal democracy. But there's also the other side. And one other point. When you speak about religion, I believe that you're absolutely right, of course, on your country in emphasizing the importance of religion in Russia. I think religion is very important in America too. It is one of the reasons of the political change in America, the mobilization of deeply religious people, the Baptists, evangelicals. So I don't see the decline of religion in America. I see actually the political radicalization of religion in America. I see the decline of religion in Europe, not Russia, Europe, Western Europe. So that is another point I wanted to bring up. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, so Monica Toft, I'm an American. I'll talk about the American situation. I think, we're 17 months into the Trump administration. It really is sort of an outside administration that is seeking to deconstruct the state. And the question, I think, that cannot be answered until after 2018 and I think 2020 is if Trump gets a second administration, I think then you can say indeed that liberal democracy in the United States is on the run. But there are some hopes. We had a primary yesterday. And a number of progressives and a number of conservatives who would have, helped the situation with Trump and harmed the mainstream Democrats are giving hope to challenges to this deconstruction of the administrative state. Evangelicals just recently, you're right about the politicization of religion. It started in the 1970s with the Roe v. Wade. It really brought out the evangelical vote. They are now sort of turning on Trump. They supported him, but they're asking, in their evangelical way, where is Christ in all of this? We're forgetting about our brother. And they just issued a very important letter that is basically calling their church to arms to say that this administration is actually not doing right by the population that voted for them. So I guess what I'd say is that we can lament and say indeed that the Trump administration is mercurial. We don't know where it's headed, but at this point it reminds me of when Bush was put into office basically by the Supreme Court. This is George W. the first time. It was a question mark about the support for him, and then when he was elected the second time, that had a profound impact. And similarly with Trump, I think we need to watch 2018, and in particular 2020, and I think if he's voted, or somebody of his ilk has voted into office, then I think we can start talking about the real demise of liberal democracy, because then the institutional, judicial, our legislature right now is not doing its job. It is not doing its checks and balances on this president, who is running roughshod. I mean, we've been talking about this a lot this morning about the president not having checks. and Congress is not doing its job, but you are seeing a lot of retirements because Republicans, some of them are quite nervous. Paul Ryan is stepping out. McConnell, Mitch McConnell, one of his allies lost the primary yesterday. So I think it's too soon to tell, is what I'd say. And we're all, I don't know, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that 2018 turns out better, and that indeed by 2020 we have some real, decent candidates who can help sort of guide the United States into the 21st century.
Comment. I agree. You said that in garages, some bright guys are starting some tremendous, ideas. But how many Steve Jobses you can have in America? One in 20th century. A couple of might be, at least he considered Bill Gates as a very secondary mind, but he was very shrewd guy, that's why he could have, might be, this kind of assessments. Second, when I was talking about crisis of religion in America and discreditation of church and church institutions and priests and all these clergies, it's because at the beginning of 20th century, all nation was religious. Now you have only segment. Yes, of course, evangelicals are very politically active people who are the core of radical conservatives and Republican Party. And, the problem is, again, it's a good opportunity to say something about the institutions. The problem is that the crisis of American institutional system, it's not because of Trump or George Bush Jr. The problem is in your constitution, the excesses of checks and balances, and practically dysfunctionality of American political system. You can believe not a communist guy told me that, but John McCain in his office told me, it's a shame. For 8 years of Obama administration, Americans failed to pass any budget. Can you believe that? In any democratic society, parliament could be disbanded, president or prime minister could be kicked out. But this was because everybody understands, and by the way, in his last 2 books, a lot wrote about that. Even Frank Fukuyama, though, is catching up and becoming better, of course, in his political order and political decay, that everybody is talking that 18th century constitution is obsolete, and these excessive checks and balances, they are not letting American political system function properly, but nobody dares publicly in political sphere to say about that, because this is a sacred cow. This is one of the elements of American exceptionalism, which means telling this, you must say goodbye to American exceptionalism. This is your problem, and unfortunately, this is not only your problem. If your political system was very attractive to copy the others, nobody is now trying to copy, and it's not absolutely attractive because it's dysfunctional.
Can I follow up, please, on a couple of comments?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, first of all, John McCain, who's in his final days, and we all feel badly about that. It's great that after 8 years of leading obstructionism against the Obama regime, to make sure that party politics actually took precedent over the collective good.
Political system is flawed.
No, it simply means that good leadership is hard to find. I think that's what that means. But regarding the issue of religion, I think it's really interesting to kind of deconstruct religion and the way we measure religiosity. I mean, there's an entire literature that talks about the difference between belief and belonging and commitment to formal religious institutions as an old way of of understanding religiosity. And I think we're seeing in the case of the United States with the impact of evangelical Protestants in particular on U.S. voting patterns, but American foreign policy, that there are other ways to think about religiosity, as in the case of Russia, where on the face of it, it appears that the Patriarchate of Moscow and the Orthodox Church is enormously powerful. But if we deconstruct the Orthodox Church in Russia, we know that there are great cleavages within that church, from the senior hierarchical level to the middle clerical level to the local grassroots level. And that brings me to a final point, which is the interesting transnational alliances that we begin to see now between evangelical Protestants and the Moscow Patriarchate for the purposes of deploying soft power around precisely the kinds of values and norms that you described, everywhere from Southeastern Europe to Western Europe, and the United States and Russia, along exclusivist lines rather than pluralist lines, which many people, as in the evangelical church and other Orthodox Christians, see as incompatible with pluralism and liberal values. So I think from the perspective of religion, we shouldn't fall into the trap of kind of essentializing and reducing. It's a very, very complicated story, and it's happening on both sides of the Atlantic with very interesting kind of political impacts.
Thank you. We have time just for one quick question. Wait for the mic.
Well, I thought I would address my question to Professor Fletcher. You mentioned that, I have it correctly, that there's a tradition of centralized government in Russia. And my question is really about your definition and views on liberal democracy. And what is, first of all, how do you define it? Because obviously there are lots of different liberal democracies in the world. And to me, one essential aspect of liberal democracy is accountability to the people. And another aspect is human rights, negative rights. And obviously that's something that doesn't necessarily deliver economic rights, and that's what maybe some claim is the benefit of the Soviet Union, although maybe there are some questions about that too. But I wonder about the critique of liberal democracy. And then, of course, there's the question, what would cause it to fail? What is it about historical determinacy, in your view, that means that it's not sustainable?
This question should be addressed to Andronik, because she is the critic of liberal democracy, not myself. I am actually an advocate, if anything. So I agree with your definition. Accountability of elites is key, I think, and the separation of powers is also very important, and human rights too.
Sorry, Volodya, just read the book which we published, my institute, together with Adam Przeworsky and 8 other great theoreticians of the current democracy. We published a book, it's called Russian American and Western book, Democracy in Russian Mirror. You can find everything over there. John Forjon, Adam Przeworsky, Stephen Holmes, and 8, 9 the best minds who were dealing with democracy and Russia. That was the substantive book. About many substantive questions. Accountability, by the way, was one of the basic critiques on behalf of Western participants. And Stephen Holmes even went so far to say a great stupid things, that because of lack of accountability for Russian hierarchy, power institutions before the public, that's why no difference between Tsarist Russia, Communist Russia, Democratic Russia, Yeltsin's Russia, and Putin's Russia. Because when you are choosing only one element, unaccountability, then you can go too far and be absolutely inadequate. Yes, this is a problem of accountability, which is important, and we're working on it. We are still far away from complete accountability. Sorry, Volodya.